Growing up on a farm far from town, I was used to silence. No cars, no neighbors, just endless fields and thick woods surrounding our property. My dad and I lived alone out here, and we liked it that way. It was safe, or at least it used to be. It started one evening after chores. I was locking up the barn when I saw something in the cornfield, a small flickering light moving between the stalks. It wasn't fireflies, and it wasn't the moon. It moved too smoothly, too deliberately. I told Dad about it when I got inside. He frowned, rubbing his jaw. Could be a hunter lost his way, he said, or some idiot messing around. But hunters didn't carry lanterns, and no one messed around this far from town. Dad didn't take chances. The next morning, he set up a trail camera near the cornfield. If someone's out there, he said, we'll know. For 2 nights, nothing happened. But on the 3rd morning, we checked the camera, and what we saw made my skin crawl. There, in the middle of the frame, was a man's face. He wasn't moving, he wasn't smiling, he just stood there staring directly into the lens. His eyes were dark, his skin weathered, his clothes dirty like he'd been sleeping outside. The worst part, he wasn't standing in the field. He was closer. Right at the edge of our property. Dad didn't say a word. He grabbed the shotgun from above the fireplace, checked the shells, and set it by the door. That night, we locked every window and door. The motion sensor lights were on, the shotgun was loaded, and we waited. Hours passed in silence. Then, sometime past midnight, the backyard sensor light flicked on. I shot up in bed. My room faced the backyard, and through the thin curtain, I saw a shadow move. Slow, steady. My breath caught. Dad, I whispered. He was already up, shotgun in hand. Together, we moved to the back door. Through the glass, the yard was lit up, but we saw nothing. Then, movement, at the tree line. A tall figure stepped just out of the light's reach. Dad threw the door open and aimed the shotgun. You got 5 seconds to leave or I start shooting. The figure didn't run. He just stood there, watching. Dad cocked the gun. I said, the light shut off. Total darkness. I barely breathed. The silence was crushing. Then slow footsteps, not toward us, away. The next morning we checked the yard. No footprints, no sign of him. But then we saw the barn door. It was open, just a crack. That door was always locked. Always. Dad raised the shotgun as we approached. He nodded at me to pull it open. My hands shook as I grabbed the handle and yanked. The barn was quiet. Dust swirled in the early morning light. Everything looked normal, until I saw the hay, footprints, fresh ones, leading toward the back wall. We followed them. They stopped near the old wooden shelves like he had stood there for a while, just standing. Dad exhaled sharply. He was in here. He locked the barn tight, but we both knew locks didn't mean anything anymore. That night I barely slept. Every sound outside made my skin prickle, the rustling of corn, the wind against the house. Was he out there, watching? At some point I dozed off, then, click. The front motion light, my eyes snapped open. I rolled over to look out my window. At first I saw nothing, just the empty yard bathed in the cold white glow of the sensor light. Then, movement. Not outside, inside. A shadow passed across the living room curtain. I scrambled out of bed and ran to Dad's room. Empty. The bed was still made. Then I heard it. The back door creaked. I ran to the kitchen just in time to see Dad stepping outside, shotgun raised. The barn door's open again, he whispered. The yard was still, the motion light humming overhead. In the distance, the barn door swayed slightly, just like before. Dad gripped the gun and moved forward. I followed. Inside the barn, it was dead silent. The air smelled like hay and dust. Dad shined his flashlight, sweeping the space. The footprints were back, leading to the same spot near the shelves. Then we heard it. Soft footsteps. Outside. Dad spun around just as someone sprinted from the barn entrance. A tall man in dark clothes vanishing into the cornfield. Dad ran out after him, shotgun raised. The light from the house barely reached the edge of the field, but we saw it. A pickup truck. Sitting at the far end of the rows, its engine rumbled to life. Dad fired twice. Whether he missed or just fired as a warning, I don't know. But the truck peeled away down the dirt road, taillights disappearing into the night. We called the police. They searched the barn, the fields, the woods. Nothing was missing. No signs of a break-in. Maybe it was thieves. Maybe just kids messing around. But whoever they were, we never saw them again. I've worked this farm for more than 20 years, ever since I took over after my dad died. It's a hard, lonely life, but it's the life I know. After my wife passed, it was just me and the land, trying to keep things running. It's not glamorous, but it's honest work. The days blend into one another, and I don't usually mind the quiet. But when Hank showed up, things changed in ways I wasn't ready for. I first met him one afternoon when I was fixing the barbed wire near the far pasture. The sun was setting, and I was sweating in the heat, just trying to get through the last bit of work for the day. That's when I saw him walking up the dirt road, dragging a worn-out duffel bag behind him. He wasn't much to look at, tall, lean, about mid-40s. Dusty jeans, a faded shirt, and boots that looked like they'd seen more miles than they should have. He had that worn look about him, the kind you get from being on the road too long. He waved as he approached. "Need any help?" he asked, his voice rough from the dry air. I wasn't the type to turn away help, especially when I was behind on the work. "You good with cattle?" I asked, wiping the sweat from my brow. He nodded, a slight grin on his face. "I can handle them. Been around farms most of my life." I squinted at him. There was something about his eyes, a coldness maybe, but I didn't say anything. "You can stay in the bunkhouse," I told him, figuring it'd be better to have someone working than not. It was old and hadn't been used in years, but it would be enough for a few weeks. He thanked me, grabbed his bag, and headed off to the bunkhouse. I didn't think much of it at the time. For the first week, Hank worked hard. He was efficient, kept to himself, didn't ask for much. I caught him a few times just staring out over the land, like he was waiting for something, but it wasn't enough to raise any real concerns. He wasn't much for conversation, and neither was I, so we got along fine. Then one day, I saw something that didn't sit right with me. I was in the field, repairing some broken fence posts, when I noticed Hank in the distance. He was kneeling by the edge of the pasture, working with the tools I had left him. I thought nothing of it at first, but when I got closer, I saw his bag lying open beside him, and in his hand, a hunting knife. I didn't want to jump to conclusions. There were knives all over the farm, tools for work, for butchering, whatever, but this one was different. It wasn't the usual tool I used. It looked new, too clean for someone who had been on the road for God knows how long. Hank noticed me coming and quickly tucked the knife into his bag, like he was trying to hide it from me. I didn't say anything at first. I just watched him. His face didn't betray anything. He seemed calm, maybe even a little too calm. "Everything all right?" I asked, trying to keep my tone casual. He looked up, that strange smile back on his face. "Just thought I'd clean up around here, fix a few things. This old place needs a lot of work." I nodded, though I couldn't shake the feeling that something wasn't quite right. Later that evening, after we finished the day's work, I went back to my house to clean up. But I couldn't get that knife out of my mind. It was too out of place, too deliberate. Why was he carrying it around? I couldn't shake the unease, but I didn't have any real reason to confront him, at least not yet. That night, I woke up to a strange noise. It was faint at first, just the creak of the floorboards, but then I heard something else. Footsteps, soft but unmistakable. I lay still, listening, trying to pinpoint where they were coming from. The house was quiet. The only sound was the wind rustling through the trees outside. I grabbed the rifle from under my bed and crept to the window. From the corner of my eye, I saw the light on in the bunkhouse. It was just a faint glow, but it was enough to tell me Hank was still awake. I waited for what felt like hours, but there was no more movement. The footsteps had stopped. After a while, I convinced myself it was nothing. Maybe the house settling, maybe the wind, but sleep didn't come easy after that. The next morning, I went out to the barn to check on the animals. The cattle were restless again, pacing near the fence. I didn't think much of it at first. It was hot, and the animals were always a little uneasy when the heat set in. But then I noticed something that sent a chill down my spine. The lock on the barn door was scratched. Not just worn down, but actually scratched into the metal, like someone had tried to break it open. I tried to tell myself it was just the animals, but the marks were too deliberate, too deep. I walked back to the house, and Hank was standing by the porch, just watching me. He didn't greet me or say anything. He just stood there, his hands in his pockets. "Everything okay?" I asked, trying to sound casual. He nodded but didn't make eye contact. "Yeah, just been thinking." I felt the unease in my gut. There was something about the way he stood there, the way he watched, like he was sizing me up. I decided I had to confront him. That night, after I finished my work, I grabbed the rifle and walked out toward the barn again. I wasn't sure what I was expecting, but something told me to be ready. When I got to the barn, I heard a noise. A faint sound, just enough to make me pause. I scanned the area, trying to find the source. That's when I saw it, Hank, standing in the shadows just outside the barn. His face was hidden, but I could see the outline of his form. He wasn't moving, just standing there, watching the barn, his eyes fixed on the door. "Hank," I called out, my voice low. He didn't respond. I walked toward him, my boots crunching in the dirt. "What the hell are you doing?" He turned slowly, almost too slowly, like he was thinking about what to say. "Just looking," he muttered, his voice empty. I grabbed his arm, turning him toward the house. "You're going to tell me what's going on or I'm done here." For a moment I thought he might snap, but he didn't. He just stood there, looking at me with that same cold stare. The next morning, Hank was gone. His things were gone too. The bunkhouse was empty, like he had never been there. I didn't find him in the fields, didn't find any sign of him on the road. I checked the barn and the sheds, but it was like he had vanished into thin air. That's when I found the knife. It was tucked under a loose floorboard in the barn, the same hunting knife I had seen him with. The blade was slick with something dark. I don't know what Hank was after, but I can tell you this. It wasn't just a job. I don't know who he was or where he went, but there's something about him that I can't forget. If Hank comes back, I'll be ready. Before we dive into the next story, if you're new here, don't forget to subscribe to our channel. Your support means the world to us. Thanks for watching. 7 years ago, I made the worst decision of my life. I took a job I shouldn't have. I was 19, broke, and desperate. I'd been drifting from town to town, sleeping in my truck, picking up work where I could, gas stations, warehouses, unloading crates at docks, whatever paid enough to get me to the next place. Then, one afternoon, I found myself in a diner on the edge of a nowhere town, flipping through the job listings on a bulletin board. Farm help needed. Room and board included. Cash pay. No experience necessary. I took the number down and called. A man answered, deep voice, no nonsense. Said his name was Grady, and if I could get there by sundown, the job was mine. An hour later, I was driving up a long dirt road past miles of empty fields. No houses, no traffic, just an endless stretch of dry land and an old farmhouse at the top of a hill. A barn stood behind it, its doors slightly open. A water tower loomed in the distance, rusted and leaning. Grady was waiting on the porch. A tall man, maybe 50, built like someone who had worked outside his whole life. He didn't smile, just nodded, gestured for me to park. "You work hard, you stay quiet, you'll get paid," he said. It was good enough for me. Grady handed me a plate of food and showed me to the bunkhouse. It was a single-room cabin near the barn, barely more than 4 walls and a cot. A small bathroom with a shower that rattled like old pipes about to burst. But I wasn't picky. "Up at 5. Work starts at dawn," he said. Then he left. There was no one else working on the farm. No other workers, no family, no hired hands. Just Grady. I sat on the cot, eating the dry chicken he'd given me, staring out the tiny window. The field stretched out under the moonlight, the wind rustling through the tall grass. No lights in the distance, no sounds of cars. Just open land in every direction. At some point, I fell asleep. Then I heard it. Something outside. A shuffle like boots on dirt. I sat up, listening. The wind had stopped, leaving the air thick with silence. Then, closer this time, the sound of something brushing against the bunkhouse wall. I held my breath. "Grady?" I crept to the window, heart hammering. The barn door was moving slightly, rocking back and forth like someone had just gone inside. Then, just as suddenly, everything went still. The barn door stopped moving. I waited, listening for another sound, but nothing came. Just the creak of wood settling in the night. I told myself it was the wind. I forced myself to go back to bed, but I didn't sleep. The next morning, Grady put me to work, feeding the livestock, fixing the fence, hauling sacks of feed. He barely spoke, except to give orders. By noon, the sun burned hot overhead, and I was drenched in sweat. "You get lunch when the work's done," Grady said. I didn't argue. By late afternoon, he sent me to the barn to stack bales of hay. The moment I stepped inside, the smell hit me, sour, rotten, thick, like something had been dead for a long time. I pulled my shirt over my nose and looked around. The barn was massive, filled with rusted equipment and wooden stalls covered in dust. But there were no animals, no horses, no cows, not even a damn chicken. So why the smell? I moved deeper inside, stepping carefully over piles of old rope and broken tools. At the far end, I noticed something odd, a hatch in the ground, like a cellar door secured with a heavy padlock. Grady never mentioned a cellar. I stepped closer. The smell was stronger here, seeping up from the cracks. I nudged the lock with my boot, rusted but solid. Whatever was down there, Grady wanted it to stay there. A sound made me spin around. Grady stood in the doorway, watching me. "You done stacking that hay?" His tone was flat, even, but his hands were clenched at his sides. I swallowed. Just about. He didn't move. I grabbed the nearest bale and started stacking, acting like I hadn't noticed the hatch. After a long moment, Grady turned and walked away. I didn't look back. That night, I locked the bunkhouse door. I told myself it didn't matter what was in the cellar. Maybe old supplies, maybe something died down there. None of my business. But something didn't add up. A farm this big should have had workers. A farm this big should have had animals. A farm this big shouldn't have smelled like rotting flesh. I sat on my cot staring at the door. The wind howled outside, making the walls creak. Then, the motion sensor light flicked on. My breath hitched. I moved to the window, peering out through the cracked glass. A shadow moved near the barn. Not Grady, someone taller, thinner. Their posture hunched, unnatural. Then, another shadow, a second figure stepping out from behind the water tower. They weren't moving toward the house. They were moving toward the bunkhouse. I grabbed my boots, my keys, and bolted for the door. I didn't care about my stuff. I didn't care about my pay. I just needed to get the hell out. As soon as I stepped outside, I saw them. 3 men standing by the barn. They weren't speaking, just staring. One of them took a slow step forward. I ran. I sprinted across the dirt, my truck in sight. Behind me, I heard footsteps, fast, heavy. Someone was chasing me. I yanked the truck door open, jumped in, and jammed the keys into the ignition. The engine roared to life just as a hand slapped against the window. A face, not Grady, someone else, sunken eyes, dirt-streaked skin, lips curled into a grin. I slammed the gas pedal. The truck fishtailed, kicking up dust as I sped down the road. In the rearview mirror, I saw them standing there, watching me go. Grady was with them now, just standing there. I never reported it. Who would I even tell? I took an under-the-table job, found a locked hatch that smelled like death, and got chased off by a bunch of silent men. I didn't want to know what was in that cellar, or how many workers came before me. I never went back, never looked for another farm job, and I never drive through that part of the state anymore. Some places you just don't stop.